December 7, 1944, 9:17 a.m. The skies above Berlin were gray and bitterly cold, the kind of morning where the breath of a pilot froze against his oxygen mask before it could vanish. On the eastern edge of the city, sirens wailed like dying animals. Civilians sprinted toward shelters. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled across concrete platforms slick with frost, loading 88mm shells into guns aimed skyward. Radar screens lit up with movement, dozens, then hundreds of blips converging toward the German capital. At first, the Luftwaffe command believed it was impossible. No American escort fighter could reach this far. Not over Berlin. Not yet. But they were wrong. Through the cloud breaks, the silver shapes emerged, long-nosed, sleek, and fast. P-51 Mustangs. Their wings flashed in the morning light as they rolled into formation above the bombers they were sworn to protect. German spotters stared in disbelief. These weren't short-range P-47s or vulnerable P-38s. These fighters should have run out of fuel long before crossing the Rhine. And yet, there they were, escorting B-17 flying fortresses all the way to the heart of the Reich. The German high command was stunned. The defensive assumptions that had guarded Berlin's skies for years had just been shattered. Luftwaffe General Alfred Keller recorded in his notes that day, "They should not be here. Not with fighters still beside them." For the Germans, this was a nightmare. For the Allies, it was the beginning of the end of the air war over Europe. In 1943, America's daylight bombing campaign had nearly collapsed. Without fighter escorts, B-17s and B-24s had been torn apart over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen. Bomber crews called those missions Black Thursday. Whole squadrons were wiped from the sky, their formations shredded by swarms of FW-190s and Bf-109s. Loss rates reached 20% per mission, unsustainable numbers for any air force. Strategic bombing, the Allies' promise to cripple Germany's industry from the air, seemed doomed. The U.S. 8th Air Force could strike targets deep in the Reich, but it could not defend itself beyond a certain range. Fighters based in England simply didn't have the fuel capacity to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe exploited this with brutal efficiency. They would wait just beyond Allied escort range, in the deadly zone called the Black Gap, and strike as soon as the P-47s and P-38s turned home. For months, Allied planners searched for an answer. Engineers debated new fuel mixtures, drop tank designs, and even mid-air refueling experiments. But by mid-1943, nothing had changed. Bomber losses remained catastrophic. Germany still held air superiority deep in its heartland. Then, quietly, the tide began to shift. At North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California, engineers under Edgar Schmud were experimenting with a sleek, low-drag airframe, the P-51 Mustang. Initially designed for the British Royal Air Force, it wasn't considered critical by the U.S. Army Air Forces. Early versions, powered by the Allison V-1710 engine, were mediocre above 15,000 feet. The Mustang's design was elegant, but its lungs were weak. Everything changed when Rolls-Royce engineers in England suggested mating the Mustang airframe with the Merlin 61 engine, the same powerplant used in the Spitfire Mk9. The combination was electric. The Mustang leapt from mediocrity to greatness. With its new engine, it could climb faster, fly higher, and travel farther than any Allied fighter before it. Still, even the best engine wouldn't make Berlin reachable without fuel innovation. That came next, and it came from quiet, meticulous minds. American engineers at Wright Field and the Bendix Corporation perfected lightweight, external drop tanks that could be jettisoned mid-flight. These aluminum tanks, streamlined and cheap to produce, extended the P-51's range by hundreds of miles. What once had been a barrier was now just a waypoint. In early 1944, test flights confirmed what many in command scarcely believed possible. The Mustang, with twin 75-gallon drop tanks, could escort bombers from England, over the Ruhr, past Leipzig, and all the way to Berlin, with enough fuel to dogfight on the return. But the Germans didn't know this. Not yet. By winter, Luftwaffe pilots were still operating under old assumptions. Their intelligence briefings stated that American escorts would peel away near Hanover or Brunswick. Veteran ace Adolph Galland had personally reviewed the figures and concluded that no Allied fighter could go farther without refueling. So when radar picked up the bomber stream approaching Berlin that December morning, Luftwaffe squadrons prepared for the usual ambush. Pilots of JG-300 scrambled their Bf-109GS from airfields around Dessau and Magdeburg, confident they would find unescorted bombers ripe for destruction. They climbed through dense cloud and sunlight bursts, engines howling, their canopies frosting at the edges. And then, confusion. The radio chatter broke into disbelief. Achtung! Fighters! Fighters still with them. The first P-51s dove out of the sun, their 6.50 caliber machine guns ripping through the Luftwaffe formations. German pilots scattered, banking hard, engines screaming under the strain. Many had never seen the Mustang before. Its long fuselage and laminar flow wings gave it a predatory, unfamiliar silhouette. It could turn tighter, dive faster, and climb out of reach. In less than an hour, the tables turned. Where German aces had once hunted bombers with impunity, they now found themselves hunted. The psychological shock was immense. Berlin's defenders, who had believed themselves safe behind distance and fuel limitations, realized the Americans had broken the final barrier. By noon, the contrails above Berlin looked like tangled scars across the sky, white arcs curving in all directions, fading into the winter haze. Civilians watching from the streets saw P-51s chasing German fighters eastward, something that had never happened before. The Luftwaffe was no longer defending the homeland, it was retreating over it. In the command centers, disbelief turned to dread. If the Americans could bring escorts to Berlin, then no city in Germany was safe. No refinery, no rail yard, no weapons factory could rely on the Luftwaffe to hold the skies. Yet the question remained, how? How had these fighters flown farther than any before them? How had the Americans defied the range equation that German analysts had calculated to the last liter of fuel? As smoke drifted over Berlin that day, the surviving Luftwaffe crews could only speculate. Some whispered that the Americans had developed a new engine with impossible efficiency. Others claimed hidden airfields in France or the Netherlands refueled them mid-flight. But the truth, as they would soon learn, lay not in magic or mystery, but in engineering. For behind the silver wings that reached Berlin was a quiet revolution in aerodynamics, fuel management, and industrial production. One that would end Germany's air supremacy forever. And it began with a single decision: to combine the mind of a German-born engineer, an English engine, and an American dream of total air control. The Germans would soon discover how far that dream could fly. The secret behind the P-51 Mustang's astonishing reach lay in a fusion of ideas, a miracle of engineering born not in one nation, but in three. At its heart was the marriage between British aeronautical brilliance and American industrial might. The Mustang was a child of transatlantic innovation, designed to fly beyond what even its creators first imagined. It began in 1940, when the British Purchasing Commission, desperate for fighters, approached North American aviation. The RAF had wanted P-40s, but North American's president, James H. Dutch Kindleberger, offered something better, a completely new design, delivered faster than Curtiss could supply its aging model. In just 117 days, his team produced the NA-73X prototype, a masterpiece of efficiency and elegance. The chief designer, Edgar Schmud, a German émigré who had fled the Reich years earlier, crafted a fighter with the soul of a predator, sleek, aerodynamic, and unforgiving. Its secret weapon was not horsepower, but drag, or rather, the absence of it. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, developed from cutting-edge NACA research, reduced turbulence and fuel consumption. Schmud's design allowed the aircraft to slice through the air with minimal resistance, conserving energy with every mile. Allied engineers described it as a wing that thought for itself. Still, early versions were hobbled by the Allison V1710 engine, efficient at low altitude but gasping thin air above 15,000 feet. The RAF found this intolerable. Britain needed fighters that could duel the Luftwaffe's high-flying interceptors. In late 1942, Rolls-Royce engineers installed the Merlin 61 engine, a supercharged powerhouse with twin-stage compressors. the transformation was instant and almost mythical. The Merlin-powered P-51 soared past 30,000 feet with ease. Its climb rate jumped to over 3,000 feet per minute. Its top speed exceeded 430 miles per hour. In tests, it outperformed both the Spitfire Mk9 and the Bf-109G in nearly every category. The Americans took note, and by mid-1943, Packard Motor Company in Detroit began mass-producing the Merlin under license, fine-tuned for the Mustang's airframe. But raw speed wasn't the revolution. Range was. And for that, credit belonged to a different breed of engineer, the quiet chemists and machinists in Ohio and Illinois who built the external fuel tanks that would rewrite the rules of air war. These lightweight, jettisonable tanks, often 75 or 108 gallons each, were miracles of wartime improvisation. Made of pressed aluminum or even treated paper composites, they were cheap enough to discard after a single use. Fitted under the Mustang's wings, they extended its operational reach from 600 miles to over 1,500. That meant a fighter taking off from southern England could escort bombers to Berlin, to Leipzig, even to Posen, and still have the range to fight and return home. American pilots called them lifelines. The Luftwaffe called them impossible. In German intelligence circles, disbelief turned to panic. Fuel logistics experts under the Luftwaffe's Quartermaster General calculated and recalculated the Mustang's endurance. They concluded the Allies must have forward bases in liberated France or secret airstrips in Belgium. Yet even after D-Day, missions originating entirely from England still reached Berlin. Their equations no longer worked. The Mustang's arrival on the European front in early 1944 marked the beginning of a new phase in the air war, one defined not by defense, but by pursuit. The Luftwaffe's veterans, who once stalked bombers with near impunity, found themselves hunted instead. Nowhere was this clearer than on March 6, 1944, the day the U.S. 8th Air Force launched its first full-scale daylight raid on Berlin. At dawn, 730 B-17s and B-24s lifted off from bases across East Anglia. Their target, the Erkner ball bearing works, Siemens factories, and the railway marshalling yards east of Berlin. It was the largest formation ever assembled over Europe. And this time, they weren't alone. Over 800 escort fighters, including more than 250 P-51 Mustangs, climbed to meet them at altitude. Among them was Colonel Don Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group, veterans of the Eagle squadrons who knew the enemy intimately. Their orders were clear: protect the bombers to Berlin and back. No one believed it would actually happen. By midday, the bomber stream crossed the Rhine, then the Elbe. German radar tracked it relentlessly, calling out "gross formation" over the radio nets. Luftwaffe units from JG-11, JG-300, and JG-301 scrambled from airfields at Wittenberg, Brandenburg, and Werder. Nearly 700 German fighters took to the air. What followed was chaos. The Luftwaffe attacked from the sun, diving in waves through the bomber boxes, a tactic that had worked countless times before. But this time, before they could reach the bombers, Mustangs dropped from the high cover like hawks. The sky became a cage of contrails and fire. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, flying a P-51B nicknamed Old Crow, described the fight. They came up expecting lambs, and instead met wolves. The Mustangs didn't just defend, they pursued. Their long legs allowed them to chase fleeing FW-190s deep into German airspace, something unheard of months earlier. They cut down the Luftwaffe's best aces one by one, forcing them to jettison fuel tanks, dive, and scatter. In that single day, the U.S. claimed over 60 German aircraft destroyed, for the loss of only 69 bombers, a ratio that would have been unthinkable the year before. The Luftwaffe's commanders were horrified. Their carefully calculated ambush zones had failed. Their defensive bubble around the capital had burst. Engineers in the Reich's Aviation Ministry began analyzing captured wreckage of downed Mustangs. They dissected their engines, wings, and fuel systems, trying to understand how they achieved such endurance. The reports shocked them. German analysts admitted that the Mustang's laminar wing was years ahead of Luftwaffe design standards. Even more troubling was the Packard-built Merlin itself, an engine whose precision machining and intercooling gave it reliability German factories could no longer match under constant bombardment. Allied industry wasn't just larger, it was smarter, faster, and more adaptable. Behind the Mustangs flying over Berlin were thousands of unseen workers, the riveters in Inglewood, the draftsmen at Naka, the toolmakers at Bendix, the test pilots at Wright Field. Every turn of their wrenches and pencil strokes of their blueprints had stretched the Mustang's range by another mile. The Germans had once believed distance would protect them. But now, the Atlantic itself seemed small compared to Allied ambition. As spring 1944 turned to summer, the Mustang became the side that reaped the Luftwaffe. Its pilots, American, British, and even Polish, roamed over German airfields, strafing runways and fuel depots. The Luftwaffe began to die not in the air, but on the ground, destroyed before it could take flight. In headquarters across Germany, despair crept in. Fighter commanders wrote reports filled with disbelief. One, dramatized composite, from JG 300 read simply, "They are everywhere. There is no limit to their reach." What had begun as a mechanical experiment in a California factory had become the instrument of Germany's aerial collapse. Yet the full scale of the psychological impact, on both sides, was only beginning to unfold. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was bleeding out. Its pilots were exhausted, its fuel dwindling, its morale collapsing. Meanwhile, in Allied briefings, air commanders began to realize what they truly possessed, not just a fighter with longer range, but a weapon that erased the concept of safety itself. And as the smoke over Berlin thinned that spring, one truth became clear: technology had rewritten fear. But in war, fear cuts both ways, and the Mustang's dominance would soon force the Allies to confront the cost of absolute control. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to the Mustangs. What had begun as a technical experiment, a hybrid of British engineering and American industry, had evolved into a force that reshaped the entire air war. For the first time in history, a bomber formation could reach any target in Nazi Germany under full escort, from takeoff to return. The era of attritional daylight bombing was over. The age of total air supremacy had begun. At Allied command posts in England, the mood shifted from defensive calculation to confident precision. Mission planners at RAF High Wycombe plotted routes deep into the Reich, Munich, Hamburg, Leipzig, Dresden, knowing that the P-51 would be there, mile after mile, clearing the skies. The numbers told the story. Between January and May 1944, bomber losses fell by nearly half, even as mission frequency doubled. For the first time, the U.S. 8th Air Force could strike critical synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, and rail junctions in consecutive waves. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilots, simply could not recover. By late June, they were losing over 1,000 fighters a month, while pilot training programs, rushed and incomplete, produced men who survived only weeks at the front. One Luftwaffe staff officer later recalled, "The Americans could send their best over and over again. We sent boys." The psychological toll was devastating. German pilots no longer took to the air with the confidence of hunters, they climbed with the fatalism of prey. Each sortie carried the dread of encountering Mustangs waiting high in the clouds. Veteran ace Johannes Steinhoff would later admit, it was not only that they were faster, it was that they were always there. That omnipresence was no accident. Allied intelligence, radar control, and coordination with bomber streams had evolved into an intricate ballet. Air controllers aboard radar-equipped B-17 Pathfinders directed Mustang squadrons in real time. When a Luftwaffe unit scrambled from an airfield, Allied operators tracked them, vectored fighters to intercept, and struck before the German pilots reached altitude. It was networked warfare decades before the term existed. But it was not just about the machines or tactics. It was about the will to sustain them. Behind every Mustang flying over Germany were armies of workers, engineers, and mechanics who kept them in the air. Ground crews at airfields like Bodny, Debden, and Leiston worked through sleet and mud, refueling, rearming, and patching bullet holes through the night. The maintenance rhythm became its own kind of combat, a battle against fatigue and weather. Each sortie was not just flown but built. The industrial engine behind this effort was staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, North American Aviation produced over 15,000 Mustangs across multiple plants. Packard built over 55,000 Merlin engines. Fuel tank factories in Cleveland turned out more than 6,000 units per week at the peak of production. These weren't statistics, they were the pulse of victory. And that pulse was killing the Luftwaffe faster than any bomb. By autumn 1944, Allied fighter sweeps, known as Operation Clarion, targeted not just aircraft in the air, but the very infrastructure that sustained flight. Mustangs strafed trains, airfields, fuel depots, and vehicle columns across Germany. They destroyed the arteries of logistics. With each mission, they strangled the Reich's mobility and its hope of air recovery. The psychological impact extended far beyond the cockpit. German civilians, once accustomed to hearing the droning approach of unescorted bombers, now saw their skies filled with American fighters flying at will. They no longer believed in the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. Even Nazi propaganda could not disguise the truth, the Reich could no longer defend itself. For Allied airmen, the change was profound. Bomber crews, who had once climbed into their B-17s knowing that 1 in 5 would not return, now felt a fragile kind of confidence. They spoke of seeing the Mustangs up there, silver specks dancing in the sun, a symbol of survival. Pilots of the 91st Bomb Group would later describe those escorts as angels with machine guns. Yet victory carried a hidden cost. The Mustangs' dominance forced the Allies to confront the brutal arithmetic of air warfare, that technological superiority could win battles but never make them bloodless. Each new mile of range had been bought with human lives, test pilots who died in flameouts, mechanics crushed under landing gear, and young fighter pilots who never returned. Even for the victors, mastery of the sky came at a terrible price. Still, the lesson of the P-51 extended beyond Europe. When the war ended in May 1945, strategic analysts began studying the Mustang's effect on doctrine. The conclusions were clear: range was power. The ability to project force beyond enemy expectation was the key to modern war. That insight shaped every generation of air strategy that followed. In Korea, Mustangs returned, this time in ground attack roles, strafing communist convoys along the Yalu. In Vietnam, their design philosophy inspired the next generation of long-range jet fighters like the F-100 and F-105. Even the stealth aircraft of the late 20th century owed something to the laminar flow principles first proven by Schmidt's team in 1940. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. The P-51 shattered the illusion that distance equaled safety. It proved that industrial innovation could overcome geography, that range and endurance were as decisive as guns or armor. The Mustang did not simply escort bombers, it escorted the modern world into a new understanding of war, one where the battlefront had no fixed boundaries. For the men who built it, the victory was bittersweet. Edgar Schmid, the Mustang's designer, would later say, "I designed the airplane to fly beautifully. I did not design it to kill." His creation had become a symbol of both precision and destruction, beauty wedded to purpose. In post-war Germany, captured Luftwaffe officers studied the Mustang with grim respect. They called it the aircraft that ended the Luftwaffe. Engineers at Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf admitted that their own designs had been outpaced not by genius alone, but by industrial coordination, the ability of a nation to turn concept into quantity. And for the Allied pilots who flew the Mustang, it was more than a machine. It was a lifeline. They spoke of the hum of its engine as a sound that meant home, of the way it seemed to glide when low on fuel, of the trust it inspired at the edge of death. In one of his last wartime letters, Major George Preddy, the highest-scoring P-51 ace, wrote, "She'll take you farther than you thought possible. All she asks is that you never lose faith in her wings." 2 weeks later, he was gone. The Mustang outlived him, and nearly everyone who doubted it. When the last Luftwaffe bases burned and Germany surrendered, the P-51 circled above the ruins of Berlin, not in triumph, but in silence. Its shadow crossed the city it had once helped destroy, a silent witness to the price of mastery. In that moment, the machine became a message. Technology had rewritten destiny, but at a cost written in smoke and blood. The P-51 Mustang had proven that no distance was too far, no fortress too deep. It flew not just over Berlin, but over the limits of what men believed was possible. Dramatized quote, "In the end," said one surviving pilot, "the war wasn't won by the biggest bomb or the fastest bullet. It was won by the men and the machines that refused to stop flying." And with that, the legend of the Mustang was sealed, a testament that in modern war, endurance conquers distance, and the will to reach farther becomes the ultimate weapon.